So today we're here to talk about what sort of issues employers should consider from a health and safety and employment law perspective in relation to the COVID vaccine. We'll take a look at what some other employers are thinking about, and I'll run through some of the results of the survey that we put out before the session to sort of touch on that. And we'll talk a bit about what process employers should be thinking about in terms of consulting with staff and communicating with them. So there's been quite a lot of discussion in the press about whether some employers will make it mandatory to have the COVID vaccine, the so-called no jab, no job sort of policy. And so far, few employers have indicated that they will make it mandatory for everyone, but it's possible that we might see that in specific sectors or for certain jobs that it could potentially be mandatory. And the picture in all of this is changing all the time. I guess we've got changing and developing science around the subject, with more information coming out about potential risks and also the impact that the vaccine could have on transmission rates, etc. So we'll touch on some of that as we go through. But the session is going to be in two parts. So we'll start by running through the results of the survey. Hazel and I will then sort of talk about some of the employment law and health and safety and data protection issues. And then we'll come on to discuss some of the issues in a more practical context. And I'm delighted to welcome today Alistair Dickson, who's the HR Director at Quarriers. And he's going to share some insights into what Quarriers have been doing to respond to the COVID pandemic generally, and also what his thoughts are about the vaccine in terms of staff and what they've done in terms of collecting data about vaccination status and communicating with staff about the vaccine, etc. So lots to get through today. But if we just start by taking a look at the survey results then, and thanks to all of you who did respond. We had a relatively small number of respondents, but hopefully it still gives you a picture of what other employers are thinking about. And the clients that responded were in a broad range of sectors. So none of the employers that were asked had decided to make it mandatory for current or new employees to be vaccinated. A small proportion, so just 6%, were considering it in relation to new employees, and the same number in relation to particular jobs. Around half of employers were undecided on the subject, which I suppose that's unsurprising because it is an evolving sort of subject that we're hearing more about all the time. On this slide then, so 2/3 of respondents plan to encourage employees to have a COVID vaccination. And if we move on to the next slide, only 1/3 of respondents have or plan to consult with trade unions or other employee representatives in relation to a future vaccination policy, and consultation is something we'll come on to talk about later. That's quite a low number there. In the next slide, 40% of respondents have already had employees express concerns to HR or their line managers about being vaccinated. And we'll come on to talk a bit about vaccine hesitancy and some of the reasons for that, which can impact different groups. And if we look at the next slide, in terms of the reasons given for that hesitancy, it included concerns from those who are either pregnant or considering getting pregnant, concerns about blood clots or other health risks, and other reasons. And then in the next slide, 80% of those who responded anticipated that colleagues or clients might object to being in close contact with somebody who has not been vaccinated, and we can anticipate having to deal with and manage those issues as people return to work more. And then 40% of employers said that they anticipated that those who travel internationally for work might need to be vaccinated, so that might be a sort of special case. And 20% of respondents intended to ask employees to disclose their vaccination status. And I thought that's actually quite a relatively low number in terms of asking for that information, but the position on that might change. And some, in terms of why people might want to know about vaccination, some said to support the needs of client requirements, depending on what those are, possibly to carry out risk assessments, or possibly because of the need to travel for work. So different reasons why employers might want to know their staff's vaccination status then. So we'll get cracking with the sort of first part of the session then. So Hazel, in terms of some of the basics, why would an employer be interested in whether or not their staff have had a COVID vaccine or not? Why is it relevant?
Yeah, so one of the principal reasons an employer might be interested in the vaccination status of its staff is to comply with its health and safety obligations. The Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 obliges employers to take reasonable steps to reduce any workplace risks. And we've seen in the press that several studies have shown that having a vaccine lowers an individual's viral load, which is associated with people being less infectious. So vaccines might not only be important for individuals' protection, but also might reduce transmission of the virus within the workplace.
Okay, so it's relevant from a health and safety perspective, but what is it that an employer has to do? So I guess lots of employers have been carrying out COVID risk assessments generally throughout the sort of pandemic. So how does vaccination sort of fit into that risk assessment?
Yeah, so probably most employers have already got an existing COVID-19 risk assessment in place, and that's because employers with 5 or more employees have got to carry out a COVID risk assessment and keep a record of it. Organisations with 50 or more employees are expected to publish these risk assessments on their websites. And as vaccination might reduce the COVID risk in the workplace, employers really need to consider updating that risk and assessment to take account of the wider vaccine rollout.
And has the Health and Safety Executive given employers any sort of tools to help with that kind of risk assessment process?
Yeah, we've got some helpful guidance from the Health and Safety Executive about what you should include in your risk assessment. And these are sort of the obvious things you might think about, like PPE, social distancing, cleaning, hygiene, hand washing, ventilation, and more recently kind of lateral flow testing.
Yeah, and so vaccination is, I guess, one of those potential measures that can control COVID risks. So I suppose it's thinking about.
Yeah, that's not specifically mentioned at this point in the Health and Safety Executive website, but I think it's just because it's maybe not quite managed to update its guidance yet, but I think that will be included in future.
Yeah, okay. And so if an employer is updating its sort of COVID risk assessments and thinking about how vaccines form or a policy in vaccination sort of forms part of that, what do they have to do in terms of talking to staff or consulting with staff about that? Are there any health and safety kind of consultation obligations?
Yeah, so again, the health and safety legislation currently in place requires employers to consult with their employees on matters relating to health and safety. So this might include things like vaccination policies.
Okay, and how does that consultation process actually kind of look in practice?
So it really depends on whether you've got trade union appointed health and safety reps. The legislation requires you to either consult with these union appointed health and safety reps or elected employee representatives or the individuals themselves, or a combination of these. It'll just depend really on the organisation's individual circumstances.
Yeah, and so consulting on an individual basis is possible, but are there any sort of practical issues to think about if an employer is trying to decide to be put in place? And a lot of employers might already have in place kind of elected sort of body to talk to about all the kind of COVID risk issues.
Yeah, that's right. I think if you've got a large number of staff, it's going to be very, very difficult to consult with individuals and take all their views on board. So it might be worthwhile trying to get elected employee reps if you don't have a trade union in place.
Yeah. And what does ACAS kind of say about it in terms of vaccine policies and consulting? Do they have any?
So the advice from ACAS is that you should be supporting staff to get the coronavirus vaccine once it's offered, and it suggests some things that you might want to consider to encourage staff to get the vaccine. So it's things like paid time off for appointments, paying staff their usual rate of pay if they're off with vaccine side effects, and they also suggested not counting vaccine-related absences in people's attendance records.
And in terms of having a vaccine policy, do they suggest that that is a good thing to do?
Yeah, that they certainly recommend that in consultation with employees. So it's really helpful to, and it's a legal requirement to consult with staff to get their views, and I guess it also helps sort of set out what your expectations are as an employer and what the expectations are in relation to employees, and it could cover things like sick pay, time off to get vaccinations, and other sort of practical issues.
And some employers have sort of expressed a concern, like, should we be giving medical information to people? Like, are there any risks associated with that? Like, how do employers communicate in a positive way, I guess, about the vaccine? And I guess ACAS is saying you should encourage folk to get it. How do they do that in a kind of safe way?
I suppose you might want to share sort of credible medical information, so you could have links on your intranet to different websites like NHS Inform, which tells you a bit more about the benefits and the risks of having the vaccines.
Yeah, and they talk about sort of signposting to official sort of sources, because there's lots of misinformation out there, I guess. But yeah, if you stick with the NHS and whatever, that's likely to be a kind of safe way to do it. And so there's been lots in the press about this no jab, no job sort of discussions. Like, what is the government's position on mandatory vaccinations? What do they say about it?
So the NHS's position is that they strongly recommend people have the vaccine when it's offered, and it describes the vaccinations as your best protection against coronavirus. But at the moment, vaccination's not mandatory for people in the UK, although the government has launched a 5-week consultation on vaccination for those who are working in care homes with older adult residents. And this is in England only, and it's asking for views on whether vaccination should be mandatory for people working in these settings. As part of that proposal, they're looking at whether there should be medical exemptions for some people. So I guess it's possible that mandatory vaccinations might be introduced for some jobs or some specific sectors, but the position might change over time, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's the 21st of May, I think, that consultation outcome is due. So I do think that would be a bit of a sort of game changer potentially, if the government does decide in particular sectors or for certain jobs it's okay to have that as a sort of mandatory requirement. That might then impact employers, I guess, what view they take, even if they're not in that particular sector. So I think that would be interesting to watch, and whether they do put in place a blanket policy or particular exceptions for certain people. I think that'll be interesting to see. And then in terms of data protection issues, I suppose we talked about employers wanting to gather that data in some cases about who's had a vaccine and who hasn't. What do employers need to think about there, and is there any guidance available for them if they're thinking of gathering that data?
Yes, data protection is a really important aspect because information relating to health constitutes a special category of data. So you must be have sort of really clear and compelling reasons for wanting to collate the data. It's not just to be collated on a just in case we need it basis, on the off chance that they might use it in future. The Information Commissioner's Office has got some really useful information on its website on vaccination issue, and also it's got some helpful examples of when it might be appropriate to collect some such information. For example, if someone works with clinically vulnerable individuals, that might constitute a compelling reason.
Yeah, I thought that terminology of a just in case basis is quite helpful. Often people think, yeah, I want to have that information just in case I might need it, but actually thinking through what you're going to do with it, telling people, I guess, why it's needed, who's going to have access to it, how it's going to be kept securely, and all of that is all kind of important in terms of people's health information.
Yeah, and you might have to think about updating your privacy policy to cover what information will be asked and what you'll do with it. And then obviously the other considerations, I suppose, are making sure that you store that information securely.
Yeah. And then I guess something that's been talked a bit about in relation to sort of employers possibly deciding to require staff in certain jobs, etc., to have the vaccine is discrimination issues. So what potential discrimination issues should employers think about if they're thinking of putting together a policy on vaccination generally?
So a blanket requirement on all employees to be vaccinated could put some employees at a particular disadvantage and therefore increase the risk of discrimination claims. It might be, for example, that some individuals are advised not to have the vaccine due to a medical condition. These individuals might be covered under the Equality Act, and then pressurising them into getting vaccinated could result in a disability discrimination claim.
And what about just sort of anxiety or worry about having the vaccine, even if it's not linked to an underlying medical condition? Is there sort of scope for discrimination claim in that sort of case?
Yeah, I guess it depends on the circumstances and how severe the anxiety is, how debilitating that might be. There might be an underlying mental health condition there that's covered by the Equality Act.
And what other sort of forms of discrimination claim could be sort of relevant if you were formulating a policy or thinking about it?
So the advice for pregnant women has changed since the vaccine programme started. So initially they were saying that pregnant women shouldn't necessarily have the vaccine, but now they're saying that pregnant women should be offered it at the same time as those in their age or risk group. Also, individuals that are planning to conceive again are encouraged to get the vaccine, although there appears to be some dispute about whether there's sufficient data about the impact of the vaccine in that particular group. So if women have concerns about getting the vaccine on any of these grounds, a policy of requiring them to get a vaccine could potentially discriminate on grounds of pregnancy or sex.
Yeah, and I suppose whether or not those sorts of claims are valid or whatever, you probably do need to sort of take particular advice about it and think about what would be the purpose of the policy and whether it could be justified in the circumstances. I think the thing about the advice in pregnant women changing demonstrates how it is quite a sort of quick moving subject, because that changed just in April, I think, and yeah, I guess over time there's new issues that are kind of coming out of the woodwork.
Yeah, sorry. I think that's right, and I think the same situation in relation to younger employees, because they might be more hesitant about getting the vaccine. There's obviously risks for COVID, for serious illness and death are lower in younger people, but the risk of blood clotting appears to be slightly higher in younger people. So the science on that might change, the data might change, but again, requiring everyone of all age groups to get the vaccine could result in age discrimination claims. Yeah,
so I suppose we've got a whole bunch of different potential issues in there. So disability, age, sex, pregnancy, and even maybe religion and belief, depending. I suppose you've got some anti-vaxxers who've maybe got particular views on that. So yeah, there's lots of different issues in the mix there to think about. And then another issue, I guess, that people have been wondering about or asking about is if an employer were to require someone to have a vaccine, say in a particular job, like if they had to travel internationally or if they've got specific reasons why that's important, if it came down to it and somebody refused, what options are open to the employer and what kind of risks associated with action that they might take? Can you maybe talk about that a bit?
Yeah, so if you think it's an essential requirement for the job for an employee to be vaccinated, it's really important that you've got a robust justification for taking this stance. And I guess the action you could take as an employer depend upon whether the requirement to be vaccinated is a reasonable management instruction, whether vaccination is a proportionate means of addressing the risk posed to staff or customers or clients. There might be pressure, for example, from other vaccinated staff or third parties, and obviously you'll have to consider as an employer whether there's other options as an alternative to vaccination.
And what other options do you think are kind of relevant to think about?
I guess it's going back to sort of the PPE, the social distancing, working from home is a big one, I think.
Yeah, or even redeployment, maybe, if depending on the person's job or the size of the employer or whatever. So I suppose those are all going to be quite case specific, I guess, sort of go and take advice sort of cases. But that's helpful to sort of touch on some of the issues. And I think we'll now sort of move on to have a chat with Alistair, hopefully, about your experience. So thank you for joining us today and welcome.
Thank you.
Start by telling me a bit about Quarriers, what it does as an organisation and how many staff you've got, etc., just to set the scene.
Sure. So Quarriers, we are a social care charity based in Scotland. Currently we employ approximately 1,600 staff and we operate across 100 services. So we've got a presence in the north of Scotland, all through central Scotland and right down into Scottish borders. So we have quite good coverage all across the country. We provide care and support to a range of vulnerable people. We work in care at home services, housing support. We have some adult care homes. We deliver support to people who themselves are carers. We work with folks with epilepsy, including operating the William Quarrier Scottish Epilepsy Centre in Glasgow. We work with youth homeless people, we work in school-based services, and indeed we have a range of children's services, so quite a diverse area. A number of charities focus in one area, whereas we've got quite a diverse portfolio. Significantly for us this year, later on in the year, is our 150th anniversary since the organisation was formed. So if anybody's interested, keep an eye on the website and social media for lots of news on that. And you can also find out there how you can support us, how you can volunteer with us, how you could work with us even. So lots of good information there.
Good. Yeah, that sounds like a really diverse range of sort of services and things, and yeah, lots of different jobs in there, I guess, to think about in terms of COVID, etc. And how long have you worked for Quarriers? Have you been there a long time?
Yes, I'm in with the bricks. I've been with the organisation now for more than 20 years, so I've worked in a range of HR jobs. It feels like it, yeah.
Well, 12 months have probably felt like a bit of a
Indeed.
Yeah, lots be busy. And do you want to tell us a little bit about then how Quarriers responded to the COVID pandemic generally before we kind of talk a bit about the vaccine in particular?
Yeah, sure. So we actually took a date that's ingrained in my brain. We took the decision on the 16th of March to ask any member of staff who could work from home to start doing that. So, that was a few days ahead of the national lockdown being announced. Right from the outset, we set up a range of things to try and manage the organisation remotely. We formed an emergency planning team. That was the first thing we did, and that met daily for the first 7 or 8 months of the pandemic, including at weekends as well, because we're obviously a 24/7 business. We realised it was really important that we could get communication out clearly and succinctly to staff. One of the first messages we got was, "You're bombarding us with information." So we took a step back and thought, who might be best placed to communicate, how we would communicate. So we created a place on our intranet where we put all our COVID related information, whether FAQs that we published in response to questions we were been asking. You mentioned the guidance. There was lots of guidance coming out. Usually comes out at 5:30 on a Friday as well. So you have to be very quick. It's not reasonable to ask staff in the front line to read a 50-page document. So we had to read that and distill that to the key things that people needed to know. PPE was a big thing for us right at the outset. There was national PPE shortages in March and April, and we were lucky we had reasonable stocks. But fortunately, Scottish Government got their act together quite quickly, and there was an establishment of national PPE hubs. So we had to, rub into that so that we could make sure that we had adequate PPE. To manage that, we set up a PPE team within Quarriers to coordinate all our PPE, so that if maybe a service in Glasgow was running low, but we had better stocks in Ayrshire, we could quickly get that, to people. Yeah. I think it's important to say that the majority of our services did not stop working, so care continued. Our staff had a really tough time. They had to do what's already a difficult job in difficult circumstances, wearing PPE, trying to explain to people that maybe don't communicate verbally why we can't have close contact in certain situations, try to maintain physical distancing. It was really tough for a lot of people who couldn't get visits from their family. I mean, it's only fairly recently that visiting has been possible inside certain types of services. Excuse me, we had a small number of services that we either chose or had to stop operating. So that created us an opportunity to try and use those staff in other parts of the business as well. And again, our staff were fantastic. They were so flexible, and willing just to help out where there was a need. So really, it was just all about communicating as clearly and as succinctly and getting, the information to staff. listening to the staff and learning from what they were telling,
Yeah.
and making sure that we were doing everything we can to keep them safe while they were working.
And I suppose those systems you've set up to communicate information, they can be used like as things evolve. So like whatever you do in relation to the vaccine, etc., that those sort of forms of communication can be used for that too. And what about the unions? Did you talk to them about various health and safety measures throughout, and what did you do about that?
Yeah, we did. We're fortunate that we recognise Unison as a trade union, so we already had a pretty positive relationship with them. And right from March, that was one of the first phone calls we made, was actually talking to the union, saying that we were asking staff to work from home, and we arranged 2 weekly formal meetings. We set an hour aside. We tried to keep it very focused on just COVID related issues. So for about the first 6 months, we were meeting the union every 2 weeks, and that was great. It meant they could feedback to us anything that they were hearing, but really we were being really proactive in telling as all the developments kicked in. So when people started to self-isolate, we've had over 800 staff have self-isolated at different stages during the pandemic, and particularly in April and May, it was really difficult to run services because of the volume of staff that were self-isolating at that time. Then we lived the furlough journey. Then we had all the testing and the vaccine. So there was always something that was on the go. So it was really vital that we had, clear, concise, regular communication with the trade unions.
Good stuff. And then, so what have you decided to do as an organisation in relation to the vaccine? So what sort of, I guess, sort of policy, whether written or unwritten, have you sort of come up with in relation to that? What you decided to do?
So we took the view that we can't insist or we can't force. People had to be able to make their own free choice. We were very aware also about, while we wanted to try to suggest to people we felt it was in their best interest to get it, we were conscious that we couldn't recommend it because there was a lot of information that won't be known about it for many years. So we tried to be as positive as we could. We reflected NHS guidance. We had people like Professor Leach and the Chief Nursing officers that were giving us medical advice, so we would share that and use that as
and did you share that through sort of websites, or how did you sort of share that information?
So our intranet's our main internal mechanism for communicating. So we published a daily update with direction to all relevant information, and we try to do that in a clear way. So for example, if there was a new piece of guidance on PPE, or if there was update on vaccination, we would highlight that and hopefully make it easier for staff. We also had a series of internal operational management meetings that kicked off after the daily EPT. So we had an EPT at 11 o'clock, and at 12 o'clock the operational guys were meeting. So that meant anything that was discussed and agreed at 11 o'clock, less than an hour later, it was being communicated through the the chain of command, so that we could get it out into services.
Yeah. So you've shared information with staff and I guess facilitated or allowed them to go off and get the vaccine. Have you given things like paid time off? Have you taken any other steps to sort of facilitate that process?
Sure. So just before I talk about time off, we decided, I was interested to hear Hazel talking about the Information Commissioner's Office guidance, because we found that quite useful in deciding what would be the best thing to do. Early on in the vaccination programme, despite government, advice to the contrary, we were getting a lot of requests from health and social care partnerships asking us about how many of our staff were accessing the vaccination programme, and they had legitimate reason for doing that, because the care staff were priority 2 in the national vaccination programme, and there was a period of time when they were getting priority access. So we had no systems that would allow us to manage that. So we decided to just be really honest and transparent with staff, and we communicated to the effect that, look, we're going to ask you to tell us if you've had the vaccine. It's your choice whether you have it or not. We hope you will, and it's also your choice if you tell us whether you've had the vaccine or not. And then we also importantly told them what we would do with that information. So although I have an ability centrally to know if an individual has told us they've had the vaccine, either the first or the second dose. Any information you shared was on an anonymised and aggregated basis. So if I was replying to a request from Inverclyde Council or Glasgow City Council, I might say we've got 4 services where we employed 100 staff and there's 50 of them have had the vaccine, 50 have not. So it was all high level stuff. And we gave staff the opportunity to object if they didn't want to be part of that and didn't want any information passed on. And I think there was literally 1 or 2 people that said they would rather not do it. Most people understood that.
Yeah.
So the second part of the question was in terms of time off. What we've done is we've made it as easy as possible for staff to get the vaccine. So, you get a time and a slot and you have to go at that point. So, if you were working, we release staff and we let them go. There was initial information coming from Scottish Government that the care sector has been lucky in that it's been a complicated process, but there has been a mechanism to try to get funding for additional expenses that we've incurred through COVID. And initially, government were saying that it would be legitimate to claim expenses in terms of both staff getting vaccination and self-testing. So unfortunately, that hasn't turned out to be the case, and it's not possible under the majority of circumstances to claim that money. So that's a hit that the charity as an employer is taking, because if you were on shift and needed to go for your vaccination, we would still let you go and we would have to backfill your shift so that we can continue to provide a service.
Yeah. And did you, I guess Hazel mentioned, or we talked earlier about the fact that the government's looking at carrying out this consultation exercise down south about the care sector in particular. Do you think that'll make a difference in terms of what you might decide to do in Scotland, even if it doesn't cover Scotland?
So I think both Quarriers as an employer and indeed the majority of care providers in the third sector in Scotland would not look to force this issue. I think we all accept there's an ethical and moral issue almost in this, that people have to be free to choose. There was a suggestion that our regulators looked at this earlier on in the pandemic, because there are certain medical conditions where health or medical staff might need to have a vaccination or a process, but ultimately they decided this wasn't one of these situations. So honestly, if government legislated and it became mandatory, then of course as an employer we would have to comply with that. But my own view is that the Scottish Government's position has been pretty clear and consistent throughout the pandemic, that even although the UK Government has running this consultation, Scottish Government's not been as keen. So I don't anticipate it being something that we would have to deal with up here. It's a devolved matter. But obviously if the government of the day decided it was to become mandatory, then we would need to comply like everybody else.
Yeah. And in terms of people's reasons for not wanting to get the vaccine, have they shared those with line managers, or have you got a feel for what the kind of common reasons are? Oh, I think you've gone on mute, have you?
Sorry about that. That was me. There's a number of reasons, not insignificantly. First of all, if you had COVID, there's a time lag between being clear of your symptoms and when you could actually get the vaccine. So it was January and February were the main times when care staff were getting priority, and that was still when there was high numbers of people suffering after the Christmas period. So those folks couldn't get it. There were some people who maybe had an immunosuppressant condition and they weren't comfortable about taking it. Some pregnant workers were anxious about it. There were also people who just objected to it for their own reasons. So what we tried to do was concentrate more on just trying to encourage as many people to get the vaccine. And from the information we have, we know that about 70% of our workforce have taken that. The true number will be higher because obviously we can't force people to tell us if they've had it. So that benchmarks quite well with any statistics I've seen, both nationally and for the sector as a whole. And I think that vindicates the mature approach we took, just in terms of trusting our staff to do the right thing for them. Yeah,
and sometimes maybe signposting people to advice, like on the NHS website, wherever, that might almost alleviate concerns if people are sort of worried. But, but yeah, that's a good level of uptake. And then have you had any objections whereby people don't want to work alongside somebody who's not been vaccinated, or is that not sort of reared its head as an issue?
It hasn't really become an issue for us. You know, it's something that I've anticipated, but it's really not been something we've had to deal with. So no, fortunately, it's not something I've had to deal with.
Well, yeah, who knows in the future? Something employers like to, or employment lawyers like to think about is potential for disputes and things on that. But
I mean,
yeah,
we just deal with it on an individual basis, you know.
yeah.
You know, you've tried to do it sensitively, but you know, at the end of the day, we're not going to make any decisions that would put the people we support at risk. So, you know, that would be the underpinning thing that we would look to make sure happened.
Yeah, and I think when we had talked earlier, one of the points you made was, I suppose vaccination is just one of the sort of tools in the kit in terms of dealing with the health and safety risks sort of posed by COVID. You've also got lots of other tools there like PPE and distancing and cleaning and all these other measures. And actually before we had the vaccine available to everybody, people were working with those other health and safety measures in place. So the vaccine is one part of the picture, but it's not the whole kind of health and safety response. I guess there's lots of other things that can be done to kind of mitigate risk. And
yeah, that's actually crucial, Elaine, and that's a message we've been really reiterating in these recent weeks as more and more people have now had their second vaccination, that, you know, people who have had 1 or 2 vaccinations, it doesn't matter. You know, every service has a risk assessment, every individual we work with has a care plan, so that, you know, there'll be a requirement for PPE, for physical distancing, for cleaning regimes, for, you know, getting fresh air in and out services, and we've worked quite hard to remind staff that we've come so far and, you know, we've done so well, so, you know, let's not slip and let's not leave that now. I think for the sector it's an issue that we've become aware of, that there is some fatigue about PPE, because, you know, you could be working an 8 or a 10-hour shift, you could be on your feet, it's physically difficult and challenging. You know, you might be working with somebody in a wheelchair or somebody who needs support, you know, for moving or handling. That's difficult at the best of times. Then you add that you've got a mask on all the time, you're wearing, you know, aprons and gloves. It's a tough you know, task. So it's been really important that we've reiterated that to staff, to not forget all the basic stuff that's kept everybody safe, you know, during the 14 months we've had so far.
yeah, that's been great. I'm just going to open it up to see if anyone else wants to ask Alistair or Hazel or any questions. I don't know if anything has come in so far. Here's one. Can you consult with your incident-free champions or non-elected employee representatives used for other forums, or in the absence of trade union reps, does it have to be elected employee reps elected for this purpose? I think that's one for you, Hazel.
I think not necessarily, but I think it would be a good idea to have a body elected for this purpose rather than just use something that's already in place. But I guess it really depends on the circumstances.
Yeah, so I think if you've got a sort of standing body that was already set up, I suppose it's maybe looking at what their constitution is or their reason for being, and determining if health and safety is one of the issues that they were kind of designed or set up to be used for consultation for. So if you've got a suitable body where health and safety is a kind of sensible thing to talk to them about, it might be possible to use that body. If not, you might have to look at putting elected employee reps in place specifically. But there'll be some workforces where they've got a trade union and trade union safety reps, some workforces where they've only got part of their workforce unionised, in which case they might have to consult with trade union reps for part of it, employee reps for part of it. But yeah, for most organisations, having a sort of suitable committee in place to talk about health and safety related things is probably going to be useful, apart from very maybe small employers where they can consult individually. Does anyone else have any questions? Hazel, have you got anything you want to ask Alistair? I think we've got a couple of minutes left.
I just found it quite interesting what you were saying about fatigue in relation to PPE, and I think everyone's kind of feeling that now. It must be particularly difficult in your sector.
Yeah, I mean, as I stressed, it is a, it's a hands-on job, and it's difficult. And the guys on the front line have been doing this now, since March of last year, and have the potential for this to continue for a while yet. So we haven't really touched on our staff engagement, but we've tried to communicate in a number of ways. And of course, one of the things you would do is you would go and visit a service and talk to people, and that wasn't possible because one of the first things we had to do is reduce footfall so we don't bring infection into services. So we've had to use things like the Teams or Zoom calls, other ways of communicating, speaking to people on the phone, using surveys, just to make sure that our staff can communicate with us and share with us, because often there's wee simple things in a head office you might not realise, but it makes such a difference if you can implement it, on the ground. So, hats off to the staff in the front line. They've done a remarkable job.
Yeah. I've got another question through for you. Alistair, are you aware of whether or not other care home providers are looking at making vaccination compulsory?
So the question was specific to care home. If I talk generally about the sector, there are bodies that represent the third sector. So I attend these meetings and I hear what other providers are saying. I do not get the impression that there's a groundswell of opinion amongst care providers in Scotland for mandatory vaccines. I don't think there's a desire for it at all. I don't get a sense that anybody's pushing for it.
Right. And there's a question here of service users, family members challenged you on whether staff are vaccinated. I think that's interesting because if organisations start to get questions through either from clients or other.
So we've had a couple of family members have asked us about vaccination status of staff members, and really we're not going to say so and so is vaccinated, so and so is not. That's not something we could do. So we can highlight at high level that we've been encouraging uptake and we've got good uptake, but really it's just about reiterating that the vaccine is only part of the protection that's afforded. It's back to the safe way we operate services, the use of the PPE and the maintenance of physical distancing safely where that's possible as well, and generally in any aspect of a question about care from a loved one, if you can sit down and just have an honest and transparent question, it's usually possible to reassure them. So yeah, we've been asked it a couple of times, but nothing that's come to a point where it's been unsolvable or unresolvable.
I've got another one through. Alistair, have you found a reluctance for care home staff to have their second vaccine?
No, not at all. Indeed, if anything, I've had quite a lot of staff have been asking for help in getting the second vaccine because it's been quite I wouldn't like to be responsible for coordinating the vaccine programme. It's a huge undertaking, and they've adopted different approaches in different health board areas, and then they've changed the way that it happens, midways. Indeed, during, I think it was March time, they had some spare capacity, so we got a lot of short notice appointments, and some of these people are finding it difficult now to get appointments for their second one. So fortunately, we have some contacts where we can, direct people to the right people to get it resolved. So no, quite the opposite. If anything, my problem has been getting enough availability for vaccines and for clinics for staff.
Well, I guess it's good that people are kind of keen to have it. And then I think we've got 1 minute left just for final one then. So just a question about staff doing sleepovers. Have they expressed concern about going into the homes of service users who've not been vaccinated?
So again, this isn't really something that has been an issue. People who are recipients of care, they've been able to get the vaccine if it's been appropriate for their own health needs. It's all back down to the risk assessment and the PPE and the safe distancing. A sleepover or indeed a wake and night shift is a standard routine part of a care shift. It's essential that we've got people there if it's assessed as being appropriate. So I can honestly say that that's not a question I've been asked at all. No.
Not come up. Oh well.
No.
Well, I think we'll just close there, but thanks very much. That's been fascinating to hear about your sort of story through COVID. I'm sure hopefully we're almost at the end of that sort of journey. But yeah, it's been great to hear from you today. And if anyone's got any questions that they want to ask, please do get in touch. Thank you.